Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us for the first of our Spring Seminar Series events, hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. My name is Dimitris Kralis, and I'm the director of the center. Each year, we invite scholars to present their research on a wide range of Hellenic topics, including archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek history, as well as literary and cultural studies. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event was organized at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Tooth, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. I would also like to remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, please visit the SFU IT Services website. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will host a Q&A session. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box during the presentation, and we will do our best to address them afterwards. If you would like to ask a question verbally, please use the raise hand button, and our event assistant will unmute you. Now, I'm pleased to present Dr. Sergio Basso. Sergio is this year's 2020-2021 Hellenisms Past and Present, Local and Global Postdoctoral Fellow at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies. Dr. Basso holds degrees from the Oriental Languages Department of the University of Venice, the Classics Department at the University of Milan, and Universitat Roma III. He has lived in China, pursuing his academic studies in Oriental art and literature, and is an active filmmaker whose work was recently featured at the VIF. On top of that, he's a Byzantinist. During his time at the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies, Dr. Basso is finalizing his book manuscript on the transmission of the tale of Barlaam in Asaf. Now, please give a warm welcome to Sergio, who will be speaking today on late antique storytelling, dramaturgy, and rhetorical practices by way of the Clementine novel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Professor Kralis and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies for this wonderful opportunity. Our talk today will be, first of all, an invitation to read a forgotten masterpiece of classical literature. The book in question is the so-called Clementine novel, that is to say, the story about Clement, written in the 4th century AD, but set among the second generation of Christians in the 1st century. Why, you might ask, should I pick up a novel of the 4th century to have some fun while sipping my hot chocolate? Well, firstly, because I think we should go back to primary literature more often, and secondly, because it is my contention, this novel resists the ravages of time. In order to persuade you about the power and absolute freshness of this novel, let me start from a passage and allow me to give you some context. We have two separate books, homilies in Greek, and recognitions in Latin, which recount more or less the same plot. The content differs slightly in the two books. In both, the narrative is related in the voice of Clement himself. It is therefore a first-person narrative, which is already a sign of modernity and freshness. We come to know Clement when he is a young, disoriented chap in 1st century Rome. And let's listen to his own voice. It's the beginning of the book. I, Clement, who was born in the city of Rome, was from my earliest age a lover of chastity, while the bent of my mind held me bound as with chains of anxiety and sorrow. For a thought that was in me, whence originated I cannot tell, constantly led me to think of my condition of mortality and to discuss such questions as these: whether there be for me any life after death, or whether I am to be wholly annihilated, whether I did not exist before I was born, and whether there shall be no remembrance of this life after death. And so the boundlessness of time shall consign all things to oblivion and silence, so that not only we shall cease to be, but there shall be no remembrance that we have ever been. This also I revolved in my mind, when the world was made, or what was before it was made, or whether it has existed from eternity. for it seemed certain that if it had been made, it must be doomed to dissolution. And if it is dissolved, what is to be afterwards? Unless perhaps all things shall be buried in oblivion and silence, or something shall be which the mind of man cannot now conceive. In Rome, Clement hears the preaching of a man of Judea who relates the miracles of Christ. Clement decides to follow him to Caesarea in Palestine. In Caesarea, Clement meets the Apostle Peter and becomes his scribe. In fact, Peter has not become the first pope yet. He's preaching the Christian message from town to town in Palestine and is subject to the supervisor in Jerusalem, whose name is James. More specifically, the Apostle Peter has an order to transmit to the head of the Church of Jerusalem, James, accounts of all his teaching. This is why Peter needs a scribe, why he chooses Clement, and why the title of one of the two versions of the story is Homilies, that is, public discourses on religious subjects. It's the collection of Peter's discourses arranged by Clement. We are reading a sort of road movie in the 4th century. Clement and Peter travel from town to town along the coast of Palestine. After Caesarea, they go to Laodicea, and from there to Aradus. Clement meets the foe of our story, Simon Magus, Peter's opponent, a sort of evil doppelganger. Peter goes out to debate Simon in a 3-day public theology contest. It was a common form of entertainment at the time. Simon, being bested, flees during the night to Tyre. As he escapes, Simon raises ghosts, infects people with disease, and brings demons upon them. He must be stopped, so Peter decides to pursue. And during the pursuit, Clement is baptized and recounts his personal history to Peter. He lost all of his family when he was a child. In fact, soon after Clement's birth, his mother had a vision that unless she left Rome speedily with her twin elder sons, she and they would perish miserably. His father, who believed stubbornly in visions and horoscopes, promptly consented and sent them with many servants to Athens, but they disappeared en route, and nothing could be learned of their fate. Finally, when Clement was 12 years old, his father set out to search the rest of the family, and he too was never again heard from. The rest of the book, sorry for the spoiler, deals with Clement and Peter finding the lost members of Clement's family. This explains the choice for the title of the Latin version, The Recognitions. Let me share with you the moment when Peter finds Clement's father, Faustus, and all the family gets reunited. As soon as Peter revealed to Faustus that we were his sons, all the old man's limbs were weakened, and he fell down in a swoon. But we, his sons, rushed to him and embraced and kissed him, fearing that we might not be able to recall his spirit. And while these things were going on, the people were confounded with very wonder. But Peter ordered us to rise from embracing our father, lest we should kill him. And he himself, laying hold of his hand and lifted him up as from a deep sleep, and gradually reviving him, began to set forth to him the whole transactions as they had really happened. The book features an epilogue in the form of a letter by Clement. In it, Clement relates that many years later, Peter provided final instructions on his deathbed, setting Clement in his own chair as his successor in the See of Rome. Clement is Pope Clement, the second Pope. The whole story is his Bildungsroman, the journal intime of his formative years as a young Christian. The book is only to be shared with circumcised, pious teachers, and even then, only one part at a time. The novel is written in a sophisticated way, yet its prose is smooth. The depiction of the characters is still so vivid, and their psychological reactions are so coherent and lively that the book seems to absorb us and bring us back to the first century, as though we were direct witnesses of the events. The funny thing is that those events never happened. But imagine how strong this fictional lasso had to be for the reader when the novel came to light 1600 years ago. On top of that, this novel leads us into the forge of Christian thought when Christian theology was still shaping itself. It's like time traveling to the beginning of Christian culture. Flipping through its pages gives me a very concrete feeling, the same sensation I feel when I come across a Paleo-Christian church walking randomly through modern-day Rome. More, it speaks to us in an unusually contemporary wording. At least this is what I feel when I read it, so I want to share this experience with you. As you can see, the structure of the novel is complex, and this complexity could take place because the 4th century schools had a peculiar attention in rhetoric and structure. Today we could say in dramaturgy. Let me show you how. I would like to start with a major insight from George Kennedy. You don't have to worry for bibliographical reference. I'm going to attach all of them via Zoom chat now. So you can store them and consult them at your ease. George Kennedy, in a 2003 essay, developed the concept of the rhetoricalization of imperial literature, a period in which our novel falls, by drawing a parallel between the training in the rhetorical figure of ethopoia in rhetoric and dialogue writing in the Greek novel. I would go further, suggesting a parallel at a higher level, not trope by trope, but structure-wise. Such rhetorical training must have refined the skills in dramaturgy in generations of students. The fashionable teaching method in the field of rhetoric was the Stasis Method. It might be noteworthy to recall the origin of this term, which stems from a similitude in Aeschines against Ctesiphon. Osper orates tu spuktas perites Stasios allelois diagonizomenus, uto kai hume super tes polios perites Stasios automacheste. As therefore in gymnastic contests you see the boxers contented with one another for position, so do you, for the city's sake, fight with them the whole day long for position as regards argument. Hence, Aeschines was stretching the image of a boxer's stance to the position taken up by a litigant, especially a defendant. We could therefore translate stases as standpoints in relation to a topic. Getting trained to take up a posture and to shadow box with the opposite posture must have been a great exercise in sermocinatio and dialogue writing. In the Clementine novel, two dramaturgical axes are intertwined, a few strong horizontal lines and several thinner vertical lines. The modern reader is well acquainted with this dramaturgical grid because it still operates both in multilinear films and in TV series. The horizontal dramaturgy gives a series and each season its central narrative and thus a solid backbone. It supports the narrative strand or a continuous motive of pattern whereby the episodes are related to each other in such a way that there is a constant progression. On the other hand, the vertical dramaturgy handles the short-term events of a single episode. The Stasis pedagogy had a precise formula for the horizontal dramaturgy. Ta aparches achritelus, the things from the beginning to the end, the structure. I suggest that Stasis pedagogy with a specific set of exercises would have improved the dramaturgical skills of students. I base this assertion on what we know from the syllabi of the teachers of the rhetoric of the 2nd century AD, thanks to recent in-depth studies about said syllabi. For example, in Theon's treatise of 15 exercises, students were invited to read, anagnosis, listen, acroasis, lessons of listening to somebody else's composition, rephrase, exergesia, development with the same words or different wording. Exegesia in particular started as an oracle exercise, beginning with short sentences, then it switched to a written exercise from lengthier text. In the last stage, the teacher would require a written exercise in the style of another author. Education in performing arts still features similar exercises. In my education as a theater director in the early notes in Moscow, the Russian pedagogue Yuri Alshitz gave our class traditional exercises about mental mind maps in order to grasp the whole plots of Shakespeare's Hamlet and Plato's Ion. After an ad lib rendition of the precise mind map of all the story bits, the next step was to gain a more precise adherence to the original wording. The final exercise was memorizing the whole of Plato's Ion verbatim. This last part of the exercise required a certain interval of time and a mind map of the overall structure of the speech. It is worth mentioning the 4 modes of this exergesia expansion: permutation, addition or subtraction, and substitution. Theon notes that the exercise was to perfect not only the quality of the expression, but also the quality of the comprehension of the structure of the whole text. My point is that a writer instructed at the school of Stasis would probably put the same idiosyncrasies in action while composing materials other than declamations. In fact, we shouldn't forget that in rhetoric, students were trained to speak on a wide variety of themes, actual and historical, as well as fictional. The fictional part is called, for example, catastasis in antiphons, tetralogies. These exercises performed during students' teenage years would influence not only the writer's mind frame, but also the reader's. An even more important point is that following the essay of Eve in 2004 on Menander the Rhetor, we know that school programs in rhetorical training underwent a major reform in the 2nd century AD. Teachers anticipated the age when young people had to be trained on structure. Rhetoric was needed for debates in trials. Greek theorists in the 2nd century produced more detailed and systematic analysis of the structure of the whole trial in court and attached them directly to the prolegomena. In other words, the structure becomes more important. The student had to hold all of it to know how the whole case was to be argued before even learning how to hone the prologue. In fact, when one composes a speech or a novel, one doesn't write from left to right. One first envisages a mind map made up of story bits, and then she develops it in a written form. A visual demonstration of the training would-be rhetoricians by the use of mind maps is the abundance of diagrams in the manuscript tradition of the treatises of rhetoric. For example, the Urbinas Graecus 130, which collects a completed course for training in rhetoric collected from different authors: John Doxophatres, Aphthonius, Hermogenes, Maximus. I've devoted some time to include analysis of the state-of-the-art stasis theory in the 2nd and 3rd century, because since our homilies were written in the 4th century, they were conceived and distributed in a context that came well after such a pedagogical reform. Indeed, we can see the consequences of this reform in the well-wrote structure of the novel. Enough about relationship between pedagogy and dramaturgy. Let's come now to the origins of the book. Homilies' origins are disputed. Greek, Syriac. The events of the plot tend to highlight the area from Caesarea to Antioch. An area with at least trilingual speakers. Greek by the elite that came from Greek families or for administrative reasons. Latin for jurisprudential interactions. Trials had to be held in Latin at least until Diocletian's reform in the 70s or the 3rd century AD. Some form of an Aramaic dialect, which at that time and in the north, in the area between Antioch and Edessa, could well have been Syriac. We can safely state that the Syriac reduction available to us was made before 411, as the earliest Syriac manuscript is dated 400 AD. Scholars usually infer that the Syriac version is later than the Greek one. Why does the order of versions matter? I have a hypothesis about that. What was the language of expression of the elite in this area at the moment of the redaction of homilies and recognitions, that is the second half of the 4th century? Should we surmise a clear-cut polarization of Greek intellectuals versus Syriac intellectuals versus Jewish intellectuals? No. In funerary inscriptions in the Hebrew-speaking area, for example, in Kirk Marara, right outside Edessa, these are the location of the story, and let me lead you to Kirk Marara. People often showed they had a classical culture, writing in Greek, without professing or even hinting at their Jewish faith. Most of the extant literary sources tend to hide this linguistical complexity precisely because of their aim. In order to strengthen the identity of their own group, they stress the differences and minimize the points which their group has in common with others. Ideas travel from one group to the other, even against the will of the leaders. We know, for example, that church fathers complained about Christians visiting synagogues. People's place in society was determined by a web of overlapping and conflicting loyalties, of which they were not always fully conscious. This is perhaps best illustrated by the fact that all inhabitants of Edessa took part in a pagan religious feast until at least the end of the 5th century. Jewish, Christian, and Gentile ideas appear in a mixture in magic texts as late as the 9th century. In such a multilingual area, it might be an error of perspective to think that the Greek version of the Clementine novel came earlier, and the Syriac translation ensued. It is likely that both redactions were issued simultaneously from the same milieu. The scenery is even more composite because classical scholarship usually fails to portray half the Syriac world, who were under the Persian Empire. There was a linguistic continuum that, by osmosis and social networks, funneled Greek ideas into Syriac from the Greek Roman communities of the coast into the heart of the Persian Empire. The area of engagement for a large part of this Syriac Commonwealth was the Persian Empire. Therefore, in the East Syriac Church, they merged Semitic exegetic tradition, Aristotelian rhetoric, competition with Zoroastrian, whose preachers had a strong practice with orality, and Zoroastrian memorization methods. The Syriac preachers must have studied them to improve their success at preaching in Iran. From all these considerations, we can deduce that if Palestine or Syria is the area of origin of the homilies, the author or authors during their education must have been exposed not only to Greek-Roman rhetoric, but also to Semitic exegetical tradition. Let's consider then some tenets of the Syriac exegesis in the 4th century, keeping the big picture in mind. Why do we care about this? Because it matters how we read the Clementine novel. The rabbinic strategies of exegesis are commonly known by the acronym PARDES, which is the acronym for Peshat, surface, or the literal meaning, Remetz, hints, allegorical meaning through allusions. Derash, inquire, the comparative, midrashic, intertextual meaning is given through similar occurrences. And sod, secret, mystery, or the esoteric mystical meaning as given through inspiration or revelation. The rabbinic approaches, above all the Peshat, Remez, and Derash, impacted heavily on the Christian and Islamic exegesis. This set of exegetical tools, which we can see clearly systematized in later rabbinic exegesis, were not the prerogative of the rabbinic milieu. They were a set of tools developed in osmosis with Jewish, pagan, then Christian, and later Muslim theological speculation. Among all these tools, the Syriac literati were particularly sensitive to the remez, the allegorical reading. They showed a typological inclination, a sensitivity to the ominous. This acute perception of a physical world, which is an index to a spiritual realm, might have to do with the Syriac exposure to the Iranian world and to the Iranian dualistic conception of Zamig, the physical world, and Zamin, the spiritual world. Does the Clementine novel feature this particular sensitivity to the ominous? If yes, maybe this is a clue of its Syriac origin. Syriac authors called the ominous approach raza, the ominous reading, raza, symbol, mystery, probably a loan from Middle Persian arzhog, arzug, which means hope, wish, desire. Raza would be thus the expectation, the perspective of a sign. And the Clementine novel is strewn with clues of a remez reading of the plot. Faustus, Clement's newly found father, having Simon's face. The name itself of Faustus, in Latin, the fortunate, an apt name for an ill-fated man addicted to the horoscope. The characters having to recognize the neighbor's real identity. Clement's brothers being twins. It is a labyrinth of doppelganger. As for this last example, twins are rare. The writer's choice can't be by chance. It must be a wink to the apostle Thomas, the Didymus par excellence. In fact, Aramaic Tauma, classical Syriac Tolma, means the twin. So Didymos, the twin in Greek, is not an apposition, rather is a loan of his original name. In addition to the reference to Thomas, Clement's twin brothers are a clear reminder that every element in the fictional reality is a reduplication and an index of a higher reality. The alertness about the ominous goes hand in hand with a very deep leitmotif of the story. In this book, every character is led to find one's true self, thanks to the new Christian paideia. As reality has two levels of interpretation, so men have two faces, both metaphorical and literally. The evil Simon had claimed that he could appear to have two faces. Only Christian catechumens provided with proper tools can get rid of their false faces. Syriac exegesis and rhetoric might have influenced the Clementine narrative at other levels, not only with typological alertness, but also with vivid dialogue writing. In search of evidence for that, we can enter the details of Syriac schooling, as we did for the Greek counterpart, although we have to evoke a somewhat later example, for example, the figure of Narsai, 500 AD, head of the school in Edessa, Byzantine Empire, and then of Nisibis, Sassanid Empire. In fact, when Emperor Zeno closed the school of Edessa in 489 AD, because of theological disagreements, the school was re-established at Nisibis, just inside the Persian border, under the direction of Narsai. So the school changed its political affiliation, although being steadfast in its cultural reference environment. That is the Syriac continuum. At school, students learn Aristotelian logic and Christian exegesis, a la Theodore of Mopsuestia, the best known representative of the school of Antioch's focus on hermeneutics in the 4th 5th century. Even more significantly, Narsa himself wrote over 300 verse homilies, memre in Syriac, in many of which he recast particular biblical passages, including several gospel parables with dramatic style, with dialogues. I am mentioning Narsi's production because this genre, vivid memory of parables for young catechumens, was particularly fashionable in the 1st century, when the Clementine homilies were written. In other words, the author of the Clementine novel was influenced not only by Greek rhetoric, but also by Syriac tradition. To this end, I would draw further attention to the influence of the Syriac genre of the Sogiatha dialogue poem, in which two biblical characters speak in alternating verses. The oldest Syriac representatives of this ancient genre were indeed written by Ephraim in the 4th century, but many others are anonymous and therefore more difficult to date and perhaps even older. This tendency towards dramatization is not necessarily a sign of Hellenization and depends on Platonic dialogue. Lucian was Syriac from Samosata. He himself lets us know that in Quomodo Historia Conscribenda Sit, paragraph 34. And the Near East had a long tradition of dialogue writing, the sermocinatio, as a form of communication. After examining how Greek rhetoric and Syriac exegesis interwove elegantly in the structure of the Clementine body of writings, it is time to scrutinize how this dramaturgy started to flounder. The 13th chapter of the Homilies, that corresponds to the 7th book of the Recognitions, introduces a recap structure whose awkwardness is apparently unexplainable, in contrast with the controlled sophistication of the rest of the novel. Our previous interpretation of the Stasis training as an instruction in dramaturgy may be conducive to identifying possible explanations. Clement has just expounded the loss of his family to Peter in Aradus. On my saying this, Peter gave them a summary account of all the incidents, how, when they had gone on before. I, Clement, had explained to him my descent, etc. And the same goes on in Recognitions. And when I said this, Peter began to relate the whole matter to them in order and said, when we had come to Aradus and I had ordered you to go on before us the same day after you had gone, Clement was led in the course of conversation to tell me of this extraction and his family, etc. And the same occurs at 9:35. When he had said this, he turned to the crowds and thus began, this person whom you see, oh man, in this poor garb, is a citizen of the city Rome, descended of the stock of Caesar himself. His name is Faustus, etc. This part, this last passage, lacks in the corresponding segment of homilies, homilies 14. And not without cause. I've counted that it is at least the 3rd time in the course of the plot that the whole vicissitudes are recapitulated by Peter. Of course, the resume is made each time in front of a different audience in the story, but the reader is always there, all 3 times. This figure of Peter, a bountiful old man that rises up and starts every time with a recap, has an irresistible comic force. And yet, in spite of the accuracy in rendering dialogues, gestures, psychological traits, the structure of the novel crumbles at Recognitions 7:24. Then Peter, so far as he could and as time permitted, addressed the crowds on the faith of God and the ordinance of religion, and then added that if anyone wished to know more accurately about these things, he should come to Antioch, where, said he, we have resolved to stay 3 months and to teach fully the things which pertain to salvation. Peter moves from town to town, but doesn't start his catechism over. Rather, he seems one of those second sophistic rhetoricians touring the Mediterranean basin with monographic lectures. Furthermore, It seems to accommodate the content of his catechisms around the Mediterranean according to Clement's needs. What happens? I mentioned the concept of horizontal lines and vertical lines of dramaturgy at the beginning of our talk. We have three horizontal lines at play here. Peter's itinerary, the itinerary of Clement's family, catechism going on in a progressive way. We can recognize the ongoing process of narrative engineering from the points of suture of the different layers. At this point, 1 and 2, Peter's itinerary and the itinerary of Clement's family, enter in conflict because in any city, Peter should either start the catechetical course over or have a sort of follow-up meeting, but not necessarily in the logical sequence suited to Clement's learning process. At this point, the writer doesn't manage to intertwine the horizontal lines of the plot, and the fiction reveals itself for what it is, that is a theatrical setup before the eyes of Clement, or better, the embodiment of a catechetical path under a dramatized form in front of the readers for their spiritual benefit. The error at recognition 724 is a structural problem. The fiction, if you exclude this level, was doing great, running smoothly, even for a modern day reader, with painstaking care in the details of the characters' gestures and their psychological reactions. It's time for some conclusions. The writers intend to anchor the narration to the Syro-Palestinian coastal sites in a rather slavish northbound sequence is so obsessive that it hinders the dramaturgy. For example, Simon flies from Peter overnight with every magical prop imaginable, feigning he's going to Rome. Instead, he goes from Caesarea in the direction of Dura to a location 153 kilometers, that is 82 nautical miles away. According to Strabo, the journey would take not even 2 days by boat or 40 hours on foot. It is not a believably long distance for an ashamed fugitive to put between his sword enemy and himself, even in the ancient world. From the rest of the narrative, we learn that he didn't even make it to Dura, going ashore in Tyre and then in Sidon. The reason for this flaw might also be found in the distribution and in the fruition on the narrative material. Let's revisit the fruition of similar text in antiquity. The user of the narrative, more often than not, wasn't an individual. One reader read aloud and entertained a group. The group was listening to the performance. The performance was delivered in segments, that is, every time the group gathered, a reader would read a segment of a chapter. We have seen at the beginning of our conversation that the book itself, in Clement's letter to James, which forms the epilogue to the homilies, describes the target audience and the rhythm of fruition. The book is to be given only to one who is pious, and the teacher, and circumcised, and even then, only a part at a time. This accounts for the cumbersome number of recaps, which is not a mistake, but is due to the text format of delivery. An individual reader might have browsed back to the pages of the Codex or rolled up the scroll of the papyrus to reread certain passages, but with a larger audience of listeners, the reader, the writer, must recap for all. Thus, the need to integrate Peter's displacements on one side and the Clementine family's narrative on the other accounts for the incoherence of Peter's itinerant catechism in Book 7. The Clementine novel has often been interpreted as a made-up reference to the cenobitic life of the first Christian community, as opposed to the monasticism of the 4th century. It was sometimes held, and I have given the bibliographical details here in the chat, that homilies and recognitions are two versions, two deformations of an original Clementine Romance, which was longer than either and embraced most of the contents of both. Sometimes homilies, sometimes recognitions would be the more faithful to the archetype. I would contest both claims. The novel is a fictionalized handbook for preachers. So it doesn't deal either with the past or the present, but rather with the future. The narration is far from being the recollection of something past. It is not descriptive, it is prescriptive. The plot doesn't refer to a past situation. It is a handbook of future situations for missionaries. It is maybe thus pointless to look for echoes, analogies of concrete past events. The novel is patently a speculum predicatorum, a preaching manual, strewn with cases arranged in order to hone the missionary's ability to cope in a diatribe with the opponents. For example, in the course of the story, Peter sends his favorite disciples, Nicetas and Aquila, to debate with pagan intellectuals as he did with Simon Magus. The structure of the lengthy arguments that Nicetas and Aquila set up to persuade the pagans to convert themselves clearly reminds of the Stasis Method, of the Stasis Method, and offers the catechumens a strong pattern to be followed to convert their pagan neighbors. The book offers a sort of behavioral model to different types of potential catechumens, and in doing so, covers the widest possible palette of characters and catechumens. Everybody is represented. Everybody can find a mirror of oneself in the narrative, young and old, destitute and wealthy, ignorant and literati. In fact, the novel ends, spoiler alert, with the conversion of the most cultivated and structured character, Faustus, Clement's newly found father. Faustus, the patriarch of the family, gets converted and donates his house to the Christian community, and his house becomes a church, in Latin, a titulus. The transformation of private spaces into churches is typical of 4th century Rome, certainly not of 1st century Palestine. The narrative is then a disguised handbook for newly converted Christians, for example, on how to avoid heritage issues. As for its formation, I would use a different paradigm invoked by the scholarship for many works of Syriac literature in the 2nd, 3rd century, the concept of a basic document around which many sub-stories and features aggregated in different variants in the course of time. Such a basic document and several of its implementations don't need to be written works. They can be unwritten mind maps or iconographic supports for oral storytelling, such as those of Iranian Pardeh Khani, the canvas storytelling, a form of art present along the whole Silk Road. We see it in a version in Tunquan, the Chinese Turkestan, and we see a version of it in Zeruma in a 3rd century mosaics. We have numerous sources about textual transmission and distribution in late antiquity. Let's take, for example, Galen, the physician, surgeon, and philosopher of the 2nd century AD. In his On the Order of His Own Books, he himself warns us that many of his writings were put into wider circulation without his consent, either by the friends to whom they were given, or by those who found them among a friend's papers after his death, or by his slaves. Sometimes other people deliberately cut and slightly change Galen's writings on occasion, presenting the result as their own lectures. This palette of situations should be borne in mind as well when we are disoriented before the existence of a plethora of synchronous reductions of such a saga as the Clementine literature. Let's recap the topics we have gone through during our talk: the plot, dramaturgy and rhetoric, the Syriac legacy, at least one dramaturgical flaw, some hypotheses on the formation and transmission of the text. At the end of this journey, I hope I had stirred some curiosity on the Clementine narrative in you, as promised. This book confirms itself as a pivotal literary achievement, intertwining Greek and Syriac literary taste internalizing late antique types and delivering them to Byzantine literature. It is unbelievable how Greeks managed to apply their creativity in a multicultural environment, even under the stress of persecutions, and to fight, to find a way out of it under the label of beauty. May this be an example for all of us in our situation today. And now, let me thank you for your kind attention.
Sergio, thank you so much for this really interesting presentation and paper. I see you're concluding with a properly Middle Byzantine Madrid Skilitzis image there, and let's start the questions with one that Sabrina put up, which is. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on Clement's assertion that the text is only to be read to the circumcised. Is this a deliberate attempt to exclude women from the population of catechumens in the Petrine tradition, at least according to Clement?
I'm fighting among many screens. I'm sorry, I'm coming. I'd like to stop sharing. And I've stopped to share, right?
Yeah, you're fine.
Thank you for your question. Yes, it is. Basically, the point is that there are several pointers, several indexes that suggest that the origin of the novel was Palestinian. For example, the importance of James as the head of the Christian community. That's why the novel underlines the importance of the reader to be a circumcised teacher. But that doesn't imply that a listener hadn't to be a woman. So possibly the prescription about the circumcision applied only to the male audience, the male reader, the male line of transmission. We actually have several sources about the importance of and the important role of women in the Jewish community and in the Judeo-Christian community.
So, so if I may ask, I mean, I have a number of questions, but I'm thinking of the 4th century milieu, and I'm thinking of the fact that in some ways this is a form of biography, even if it is if it also tries to perform a whole set of other roles. How do we look at this biography then in comparison with other 4th century products like the Life of Basil, for example, that pick up some similar threads? I mean, I looked at the way that you opened up, the passages you cited that you opened up, which were fundamentally questions, very philosophical questions that lead him to Christianity. And I'm thinking, of course, that Basil goes to Athens to deal with very philosophical questions and engages in disputations and so on and so forth. How similar or dissimilar is that text from a text like the Life of Basil? And as a follow-up to that, then, if this particular text shows evidence of the Near Eastern non-Greek traditions playing a role in the development of its dramaturgy, can we find similar elements that have not perhaps been discussed in texts like the Life of Basil? Or is the Life of Basil just a classic case of Greek pedia in a Romanized context? I hope it all makes sense.
It does make sense, and there is a continuum between, at least of literary taste, between Greek literature and Latin, contemporary Latin literature. Think of Confessiones by Augustine, which is basically the same thing, the attempt of creating an educational autobiography for future readers, for catechumens. Well, the case of Augustine is even more complex because he had it's a huge construction to get rid of accusations of being a sort of a latent Manichaeist after 10 years spent as an auditor in the Manichaeist church. And it makes sense. Actually, in what the authors of the Clementine novel were trying to do in the 4th century was to mimic or to absorb an important trend of the literature, of the contemporary literature, the taste for autobiographies, in order to give consistency to the tenets of the novel. So it's a sort of palette of elements, just like a recipe, you know, and the mixer, the link is how believable the autobiography is. And he had to circulate in, I guess that it was meant to circulate in Palestine and in Rome as well. The ability of reading Greek in Rome in the 4th century is debatable. There are very recent studies about it by Gian Domenico Ferrazza in Rome from 4th century to 8th century, which are very interesting. And the proficiency of the Roman readership in Greek is higher than expected. So yeah, you're totally right. There is a continuum of this literary proclivity to autobiography from Constantinople through Palestine to Rome. I'm thinking of Gregory of Nazianzus as well, for example, that was autobiographical in his verses.
Mm-hmm. If I may go to Alessandra, she asks 2 questions. In terms of literary form, what possible relationship does the Clementine novel bear to the lost autobiography of Hadrian in your view? And 2, what legacy does this form of Clementine novel that is, bear to later forms of storytelling, such as the novella that originates in the East and was to later on enter the space of medieval Italy?
As for question number 1, no relationship, with the exception of what I've just mentioned. There is a strong inclination to autobiography in the 4th century. So it seems like everybody wanted to use that patina, a couch to cover the literary content and to give believability, so to speak, to a literary product. Actually, it was a fashion that was going on, that had been going on since the 2nd century AD in Greece, in the Greek literature. I'm thinking of Aelius Aristides, for example. a wonderful writer, very similar in his wordings, in his sentences to the Clementine author. Question number 2. The legacy of the Clementine novel is tremendously strong. It serves the model for the possibility of concocting a Christian novel for future generations. So it was a model that had to be updated every half a century, every 4 decades, I'd say, for the renewal of the literary taste of the target audience. So the impact was massive. Think of the figure of Faustus, for example, Faust, and Simon Magus. It would be very interesting to explore a digression about the origin of the term, the apposition Magus after Simon. It's too long a digression, but I will try to be really sketchy. Peter and Simon Magus share the same name, Simon. One was called Kepha, the stone, by Christ, and the second is called Magos, right? But in Syriac or in Aramaic, the name is the same, Shamuna, Simon. So that's why one is patently the doppelganger of the other, same name, different opposition. And Simon Magos is actually, my guess, my hypothesis is that he had to be Zoroastrian. Magos doesn't mean a magician. Magos means a Zoroastrian priest. And he wasn't called Magos in the Acts of the Apostles. He starts to be called Magos in the Clementine novel in the 4th century. So it's the story of a friction about preachers, Christian preachers versus Zoroastrian preachers. And this could not happen outside of Palestine or Syria. That's, in my opinion, one more index of the Syriac origin of the novel.
In anticipation of possible other questions, if I may ask a question about what works like this tell us about the life of a congregation, and about the significance of storytelling, of narrative, and perhaps even performance within what we might call liturgy, or I don't know how you would describe it, within the life of a congregation. And I ask this because you say that this is a first-person narrative, but at the same time, it is a first-person narrative where you have encounters and interactions and meetings and people's faces being converted into something else, in someone else's face, and so on and so forth, which gives a bit of a sense that this could be performed, whether by one person or whether by as a monologue where someone does all the parts, or by multiple people. What does it tell us about the early life of these congregations?
This is a wonderful question, because my suspect is that most of the early Christian novels, and that applies, well, actually to a large span of time, from the 4th to the 9th century, 10th century as well, were built upon and around an enkenia, a liturgy for the festival, the festivity, the celebration of the saints related to a church, to a newly built church. It's funny that modern readers usually fail to remind that point to other scholars. So basically, for example, the Varlam and Yoasaph novel ends exactly with a paragraph stating that the whole story has been retold in commemoration of the building of the church for the two saints after their death, soon after their death. And the whole novel is a sort of huge construction in order to backdate the construction of the church. The church must result as early as possible. So the novel, the content of the lives is slightly post-dated, and the building of the church, the construction of the church is slightly backdated, so that they can meet in the past, in a mythical past. Okay, the same applies, exactly the same applies to the Clementine novel, because it ends with Faustus given his house in heritage to the Christian community, as every Christian in Rome in the 1st century hoped that rich patrons would do. So that's why I'm saying it's a handbook, it's a hint, it deals with expectations. So it deals with the energy of the future, not with the inertia of the past.
If I may follow up, then, if performance, and specifically timed performance with specific significant moments in the commemoration within specific churches, is of significance, is the mobilization of classical, but also all the other Near Eastern, classical Greek, but also the other Near Eastern traditions, in the writing of dramaturgically evocative stories, also an attempt to compete in a world where other forms of public spectacle are available, and where if you are no longer a nation of under a New Jerusalem, but you are now Roman Christians who can be Roman Christians, you need to compete for a wider audience. And to do that, you need to understand that these people like public spectacles. So if you don't want them in the hippodrome, you want them in a lively church.
Well, let's try to change spectacles and envisage. No, I totally agree. The point is that that's exactly what happens. It is there is a writer, and there is a target audience, and then there is the literary taste going on, the distribution of the text going on in time, right? So it's just like a spiral movement, generation after generation. So what happens is that every generation in time and in space needs the book to be updated according to its own taste and needs. The majority of pre-modern texts actually are authorless and fluctuant in their content, right? They are open texts, as Giorgio Pasquale, an Italian philologist, would have said. That's the way he called them. In this way, they're just content to be filled in generation after generation. It's totally normal that every new generation is simultaneously both a reader and a new reinventor, reductor of the content. Then it was the only recipe that allowed the survival of the text, or else the text would have got out of the market. That's what happened to other texts that were unable to pander to the literary taste of a century by century contemporary audience.
For
example,
ahead, I don't want to interrupt.
The Clementine novel has a very strong dramaturgy. It's a wonderful novel by itself. So it affirms itself through time in spite of its real, let's call them the original intentions, okay? We can still see them, we can still spot them through what I call the points of suture of the narrative engineering. We can still see why some segments are arranged in a certain way and why others are arranged in another. But the story itself, the acknowledgement, the recognition, the reunion of a family, the autobiography, first-person narrative of the second Pope in Rome was a great epic. And albeit blatant by itself, this northbound peregrination from Caesarea to Antioch was a wonderful geographical mind map, even for catechumens in Rome. I mean, they had the right to dream about those locations, and dreaming about a place, associating it to a story or a story segment is a perfect teaching method.
Thank you. I'll go to a question by Andreas, who thanks you for a generous talk and notes, the Clementine novel as you present it strikes me as a demanding story, a story which asks the audience / listener to keep in mind contradictions, follow more than one storyline, etc. What does it say about the habits of mind Christian preachers wanted to cultivate in their audiences?
Thank you, Andreas, for this wonderful question. The paradox is that I think that the ancient they lived in a village that was more global than today, actually. So every village, every place, every city was a crossroad, definitely open to a lot of influences, and for them it was natural to do so. Sometimes we have a sort of lens which is wrong because we are obliged to use written sources, poshy, highbrow sources. For example, in Egypt, if we hadn't found the perception we would have of Greek culture in Egypt if we hadn't found the Oxyrhynchus papyri. And on the contrary, thanks to them, we have a panorama, a wonderful landscape of administrators speaking Greek, peasants speaking both Greek and Coptic, inhabitants being able to speak Latin as well to defend themselves in trial. So what the Christian preachers requested from their target audience was flexibility that target audience already had. That has to do with a huge problem of heresiology, all the heterodoxical theologies that had to be fought during the 4th, 5th century. But that happened because there was an ongoing osmosis of theologies, of possible nuances, and every believer kind of concocted, created, arranged his own belief, putting himself at the crossroad of a lot of inputs. So flexibility and the proclivity to multilinear dramaturgy wasn't a problem in the 4th century, in my opinion. Have I answered the question, Andreas? Let me know.
My sense is that that you do, and frankly, as someone who feels afflicted by the fragmentation of attention that social media kind of inflicts upon us, I almost long for this idea of non-electricity, non-crazy media distractions that allow you to exactly follow this kind of complex narratives, even in a non-written kind of oral form. Now, my question is a bit, a follow-up question would be, what kind of audience can actually follow that story in the language that it is written, in the register that it is written? Would you have to be a certain type of oral or a certain type of a certain class and education, urban inhabitant, or could you offer it, could you follow it even if in a rustic environment with less education and so on and so forth? And would this storyline be recognizable in, let's say, the interior of Syria or the more rural areas of the Roman world?
Recent studies about schooling in the late antique world demonstrate that basically a 14-year-old or 15-year-old boy, and sometimes even girl, would be able to read the Clementine novel.
Okay.
It has been demonstrated by a recent study by Stefano about the pedagogical course by Didymus the Blind, for example. And thanks to the Scholia, we know that he was addressing women as well, young women as well. So schooling was dispersed, but even heavily distributed through a lot of places, sometimes monasteries, sometimes single monks, sometimes grammatiki, school teachers, simple school teachers. But what I've tried to show in my talk is that from the 2nd to the 4th century, we witness a pedagogical reform. They basically backdated the age at which pupils had to start to deal with structure, build up mind maps. And so basically, as I said, at the age of 15, they had to be able to grasp all the nuances, all the subtleties of this novel. And that means that the audience was huge. Basically, all the literati, all the literate people, actually, had the opportunity of enjoying this masterpiece. The tone is not so poshy, by the way. The style is pretty smooth, very concrete, as I've tried to show. Even in the first questions that open up the novel, right? It's astounding. It seems the inner monologue of a teenager today, hopefully.
Angsty. Yes. So, if I may ask the audience any other questions to address? Well, what I suggest then is that I'll go through my formal process of thanking our speaker and our audience for attending today, and reminding you to please complete the post-event survey, which will be emailed to you in the coming days. I would also like to remind you that, as we said at the very opening, this is the first of the spring series talks. The next one is coming up Friday, January the 29th. I would like to point your attention to the change in time because our speaker is going to be in Greece, and we do not really want to make it difficult for them. We're going to meet at 10:30 in the morning, and that talk will feature, this day we will feature Angelos Dalachanis from Bournemouth University on women, philanthropy, and nationalism in Mandate Palestine. That said, after I myself thank you on my part for your presence,